people.
2 million?
And some of them 100,000 people, 50,000.
But then you have a vertical setup too,
Yes.
that we have
Yes.
seen.
No, we haven't gotten to that.
Would it be similar to Solari's vertical?
No.
Not at all. That's like a CC.
Okay. Let's see how we do each one. Okay. There are occasionally in universities throughout the world some unusual conditions in which two people seem to be able to communicate with each other to a large extent with some language and in many instances no language at all. And they seem to understand each other and seem to understand what one another will do. And I wanted to go into that, and there's nothing to do with telepathy. I wanted to go into how that works. And it is related to early experiments by Ivan Pavlov, and I want to fill some of you in on the early experiments, and then take it back to the telepathic. It's really not telepathic, but telepathic simulation. Show you how it works. This is what Pavlov had encountered in working with the dog. He encountered this particular setup. When he first introduced a dog, a special dog, brought up under special conditions, to a bowl, he held a bowl in his hand high above the dog's eye level, and then he put it down. And when he put the bowl down in front of the dog, the odor of the food and everything else caused saliva to flow in the dog's mouth and digestive juices to flow in the dog's stomach. He also put instruments in a little glass tube hanging off the salivary gland, hanging out of the dog's mouth. And when he came in with the food, that tube would fill up with saliva, and the dog would look at it. See what I mean? Okay. Because there was arguments before Pavlov's experiments. Some people believed that digestive juices flow at the sight of food and saliva. Others thought it only would flow when the food entered the stomach, because they felt the human body was not so ignorant as to waste digestive juices. Pavlov found out that digestive juices flow at the sight of food. And if you don't have any food in your stomach, a lot of digestive juices flow, your stomach becomes irritated. Now, some people have digestive juices flow when they're angry and depressed. It doesn't only flow to food. The system isn't that good. Everything in nature doesn't work that well. Now, he also found out, when he was sitting in the room with dogs, that the guy that was later on hired to feed the dogs, that guy would live over here in the morning, when the dog listened to the guy's footsteps coming up to the area. He'd see that little jar begin to fill with a little bit of saliva. And as the footprints approach the door closer, more saliva. He called that conditioning of the second order. This is conditioning first. The dog sees the food, saliva flows. When he listens to the footprints, he's anticipating what's going to happen. That's the second order. But in the morning, the dog used to listen for the guy's bed springs. The minute they start moving in the morning, there's a little bit of saliva. And it goes up to 4 to 5 orders before the event. Okay? Anybody doesn't know what I mean? The dog is lying on the ground and hears the bed springs change. And a light go on in the cabin. Saliva flows. The guy opens his door to come out. A little more saliva. The footprints toward the building. And human beings can go up to 10 orders. That is, before something happens. So, let me try to make the story clear. I'm going to exaggerate the story only for clarification. Let's assume that Joe and I lived together for many, many years, and we were very verbal, and yet we were very emotional at the same time. That is, I expressed my depression, Joe expressed his anger, he expressed his joy as a child, continuously. We believe in behavioral sciences that there's always an early warning system, early changes in behavior that indicate oncoming anger, oncoming joy, long before it comes on. How long before? Depends on what you look for when you look at a person. If you look at a person and listen to what they say, that would be the first order. If Joe does this with his fingers, or when he was a kid, he does this, He says, will you lend me a nickel for an ice cream cone? Then he does this someday. Before he says, hey, John, will you lend me a nickel for an ice cream cone? Then he does this. He walks by with his head down, and then he says, $1 and quarter. If he goes through a certain series of actions, I get a feeling that he's going to ask me for something. When he comes in, he says, how come things aren't arranged as they have been in the past? That means everything went well with him. He got a new job, a higher income. He doesn't give a shit what I say. So he comes in, he says, God damn, I don't want this goddamn thing. And I put it up there. He gets aggressive. This isn't true. But if we live together a long time, all behavior there's a previous repertoire that we carry to events that are going to occur. For example, the guy that says to you, would you like to go for a drive after you've taken you to dinner? That has a little more significance. You got a rough idea of what's coming. When he parks the car, you got another idea of what's coming. Then he says, you're accused. All this lead in causes, well, look, it's getting late, I got to go home. Whatever you say. The whole idea is there's always lead-in behavior. And if you live with someone long enough, you can say, you want me to go out and milk the cows. He hasn't said anything, but there's morning behavior that Richard would have regarding cow milking. So, if people live together long enough and have gone through this anticipatory system, it really does appear that I might turn to Carl and say, why are you angry at me? Whenever he holds his pencil loosely, he's about to say something. See, we notice in all people posture changes, what they call body language, other means of communication. And this is a real basis for people that grow up together, that really feel they read each other. And they're not reading each other telepathically. They're reading each other by subliminal cues. If anybody doesn't know what I'm talking about, raise your hand. I'll say it over again another way. Why, you had your hand up, Joe.
Yeah, I was going to ask you...
Excuse me, if it goes up to the 7th order, it's pretty goddamn good. In other words, if Joe gets up and kicks his nose first, and then walks over and stretches, and then looks at the table and yells, you might, when he's picking his nose, you don't like something I did. See, you can go all the way down, and the earlier you can go, the higher the order, the more it seems like telepathy. Now, I come in the morning and I beat up the door. He said, why did you beat up the door? He said, the door looked like he's going to shit on the floor. You know? Now, wait, that sounds strange to you. But that is not telepathy. Whenever that dog came in and he rolled his eyes up and put his tail between his legs, I knew that he was going to shit on the floor. See? Now, if you understand what I'm talking about, and I go back to another bit, and this is an old story I told before. Chet invited me to a party once to meet some war buddy of his. And I said to Chet, take him to a mental hospital immediately. And the guy was sitting at the party and smoking on. And Chet says, what do you mean? And the guy here says, he's sick, he's going to crack up. So, since I've known him a long time, he said, well, I'll do it. I don't understand. He picked up the phone, and he called the institute, and they said, we don't, is he violent? Is he doing it? And Chet said, no. He said, well, we don't take him. So I said, call back and say he's violent and he's doing it. Don't wait for that. So Chet called back and said, bring him right in. And I told Chet, well, asked him whether he was right-handed, left-handed, and the guy said he was right-handed. And I told Chet to walk on his right side, a little behind him, and keep busy with conversation, but be sure to stay a little behind him as you walk, and keep conversation going. Okay? I told him that. I said, all of that detail. And I had a session that night, and I couldn't go with him. And after the session, Chet comes back with bandages on. He said, what's up? He beat me up suddenly in the street on the way to the situation. No, on the way to the hospital. And he wasn't doing anything. You understand? Okay. But he was telling me what he was going to do by subliminal cues. You understand what I mean? Now, it has nothing to do with telepathy. Now, have any of you ever, I'm sure you all have, anticipated behavior either in animals or people? All right. If you don't do that, it means that you're too subjective. You know what that means? It means that This man says to me, Jesus, I put my suitcase in the back of the car, and I just went in for a cup of coffee. That's natural. I just went in for a cup of coffee, and it was gone when I came out. Now, natural behavior is when someone says, gee, just like that. That's perfectly natural. But if you've been a police officer years, you say, what time did that? There's no, my God, you mean you took your suitcase? You know, police officers aren't surprised. They cut off 3 heads, and where did that occur, and what's your name? Yeah. But normal people are always super subjective. What? You know, 4 o'clock? That happened? You know, they're always so subjective. And police officers, or as you encounter more experiences, you register differently, seemingly, again, like telepathy. And what's his name? Bob, who works at the air terminal, looking for people carrying narcotics. He says one of the clues of a person carrying narcotics, or that may be carrying narcotics, is that they stand in line a little differently than most people when they're going through the line with narcotics. Their behavior is not the same as everyone else's. Everyone else is either waiting and looking, and they're usually looking around and fidgeting more. Or they'll walk over the guy and say, hey, it's a nice job. But they try to engage in conversation with the police officer. So he says, open your suit. So he said, I look for that. But imagine that been doing that for many years, it does seem as though you have telepathy. Especially 2 sisters brought up on a farm, away from other people for many years, can almost walk over and say, call that in 2 minutes and go to work on the farm. See what I mean? Yeah. Wait, no, it doesn't really do it. But all of us have kind of an aura we feel, like we feel a difference. Did you ever feel you're going to throw up long before you threw up? Any of you sense that kind of stuff at all? All right, so it is not, again, telepathy, it's subliminal cues in body language. Posture, changes in the eye movement, changes in general behavior. Now, that is what I wanted to say about telepathy to make sure that you understand that aspect of it. Did you want to say something else about it?
It's not always close friends in universities.
No, not always close friends. It doesn't have to be. Or you have to have a habit of comparative observation. You look at a situation, the more subjective you are, the less you see. Does anybody...
They just randomly picked out students in universities before?
Who?
These researchers.
No, they run into a couple sometimes, or brothers or sisters or friends that seem to understand each other, and they test their ability to, their PK factor, they used to call it in old days. Psychokinesis, you know, the ability to do that. And they used to measure people for that quality. There were some people that had better judgment regarding probable behavior of other people. In a department store, when you see 2 black kids about 12 years old without parents, the store detective tends to watch them more so. Is that right? Now that's obvious, but there are conditions. People that carry their overcoats, there are ways of steering things, you know, and they're not different. They're not original, so they tend to watch the people appropriately. Okay. Any comment about that? Anybody want to comment on that? Since you're...
How about, you know, I read that there's another Russian, Vasilyev, who conducted a lot of experiments with hypnosis. With hypnosis, where they hypnotize a subject, then the subject would be 1,000 miles away, and they give them a post-hypnotic suggestion at that distance.
Yes.
And they checked it, and they would respond. What is this?
A post-hypnotic
well,
suggestion?
for instance, they would say,
I know what you mean.
when I command you, when you come out of the hypnosis tomorrow at 3 o'clock in the afternoon.
You'll scratch your ear, not know why. Or you walk to the library and pull a certain book.
Right. And even at a tremendous distance,
yes,
they will give them this suggestion,
yes,
you know?
Yeah. I do that all the time with people. I say, when you get to Chicago, go to Chicago bookstore. There they have a copy of Lowe's. No, there's Lowe's Chicago, and they pull out Lowe's. We do that all the time. But don't forget to buy your lunch at Sammy's cafeteria at school, darling, and you give them some money.
Yeah, but how about if you give the suggestion after they get there? That's what they say.
Well, this is strictly horseshit.
You think that's strictly horseshit?
Strictly horseshit.
1,000 miles, they said they got, I saw...
No, there is a range of things that people will do. I know that if somebody that's close to me goes somewhere, they're going to come back and they're going to report to me, most probably on things I'm interested in. Without the suggestion has been made in the early portions of the relationship. Does that make sense? We suggest things to one another continuously. Yes.
I think, I think predictability is, like you said, by comparative observation, you can establish great amount of predictability. In the same sense, I think there's a danger to that you...
yes, there is. Projection.
Yes, projection, and
absolutely.
that you are prejudiced towards...
That's why you got to be very careful when you do that. You don't go off and beat up the dog. Well, I mean, you give the dog a chance to begin to respond. Well, although you do hypothesize...
I find that sometimes I encounter people that
surprise you.
No, not just that.
Yeah.
First of all, I see also people projecting a lot, especially if they have some basic background in psychology.
Yes.
It seems like they encounter 3 bits and then they project 7.
Absolutely. I think I agree with that too. Knowing the difference is the big problem. Knowing when you think. Is there any comments about that further in that area? Okay. Now, even if you move a little bit out of that area about telepathy and you take the pattern of your mother or your father when you were a kid, they have habits of shopping. What kind of things they pick up determine what they're going to make, probably. You see, like you go to a market when you're hungry, you buy more. You know that more than you ordinarily would buy. And if you feel full and sort of almost nauseous, you tend to buy very little food in the supermarket. And we always tend to buy more when we're hungry. Well, those human behavior is predictable and lawful. And since it is, there can be a great deal of nonverbal communication. The people of the future wouldn't have to elaborate very much verbally. Meaning, I wouldn't have to say, you know, Don, you and I fought in the war together, will you turn on the fan? I can say to Don, will you turn on the fan or get me a cup of coffee? I don't mean him to serve me in the sense I would get him a cup of coffee or a Coke or whatever else. So if it's understood, you don't need to fabricate too much. And language becomes simpler. And there's a hell of a lot of people that have a high degree of superfluous language. Does anybody know where that occurs? Superfluous language. Superfluous language means language superfluous to the task at hand. Now, very few people act that way. Very few walk into a Singer sewing machine company or Sears and say, give me 9 vacuum cleaner bags, deep 2. They don't do that. There's a lot of little bits of other conversation that happens. Now, where do you see the widest range of superfluous conversation?
In my shop, where I work.
You missed church, Second Street.
I've got a priest where I work.
Oh, you got a priest?
My wife a priest.
Superfluous to the task at hand. Since you're relatively
That's why you
new.
have no task specifically.
Ah,
We have the whole conversation.
well, do you know what I mean by that? Superfluous language of the task at hand? The task at hand is what you want immediately at any time. When you go in a bakery store, you want a loaf of bread, you say, give me a loaf of rye with seeds sliced, and you pay for it. Talking about the family, if you're not concerned, you're saying, well, it certainly is a nice day, you got a nice shop here. That's superfluous to the task, unless you sell shop equipment. Superfluous language is in excess of the immediate needs. All right, superfluous language when you're climbing a hill with another soldier in combat, and you got to watch out all around you. Guys says, you know, the other day I looked at my pants and it was torn in a battle here. That is very dangerous language and superfluous.
I still think, though, when you talk in terms of communication and interacting with another person, it's the superfluous language that establishes the contact.
Yes, he's right.
Yes, but this
Yes, that's very good. The superfluous language does establish the need for you making contact with them. Yes.
I mean, to contact is strictly based on superfluous language.
I think so.
Just to make another person feel comfortable.
What do you do when you encounter it in the shop? Does it piss you off, or you just
Well,
do you handle it?
Yeah, I've been handling it the best I can. I have to work at the same time.
You know why they have superfluous
Yeah,
language?
the guy's controlling other people with it. And his value system is that of Bob Hope, that type of humor.
It works.
Yeah, way back. So it's a form of. We all do it. I do it too. But I would say that I would judge the person by what they have in mind, like yourself, your values, your direction. If the person is just exploitative, they don't know what they're doing. In a broader sense, they're not socially oriented, then I would say that why should they have the control? I wrestle with people.
Right.
I choose to do that.
Okay. Let's get on then in areas where, again, other types of areas where you find superfluous conversation. You understand it? Anybody want to name the areas where you hear a whole lot of superfluous conversation? Want to try it?
Politics.
Where? Politics. Yes, you do. Where do you hear the most direct kind of language? The most direct and significantly tight related?
Space.
Space?
You
You mean people in a capsule? The launch complex?
Mission control or...
Military? You know how we mean that? Since you're saying, look, in military control, where you're about to launch a space vehicle, the language is hard. Countdown, everything is tight related, the fuel mixture, conditions of the upper atmosphere, the camera ships out there, everything is tied in with the event. That would be hardcore language. Another superfluous type language is the kind of language you get in hospitals a great deal. Bed patient, talking to the patient. Nurse comes in, talks to the patient. If the nurse is supposed to take their temperature, you see, and do certain things, there's a quality that they have, they call tender loving care. How are your children, your fine-looking young son and daughter, all that helps the patient get well.
So is it superfluous then?
It's superfluous if the hospital is understaffed, if you talk to the nurse too long.
Well,
so what they ought to
patient.
have in hospitals are superfluous gabbers, professional-looking nurses who say, well, now, isn't that a fine hairstyling that you have today? There must be people, but you must not take a nurse away from something or a doctor away from something. That becomes an interference factor. Not the doctor doesn't sit down and say, my God, that's an interference. Fortunately, they're not that hard about the thing, because the doctor calls that the human touch. He thinks it's the perfectly logical thing to do. It's being human. But when you're working in the hospital and it's understaffed, or say war conditions, and they bring these kids in with broken legs, and you're working on them all the time, and a young guy in bed lying there calls the doctor and says, Doctor, you don't know how much I appreciate what you've done for me. I couldn't move this leg, and the infection is gone. And God, I'll be able to get back to school and get back on the baseball team. You're in a fucking war hut. They're bringing in people. Don't bother his ass then. Sunday at dinner, you say thanks a lot. But I think it's crude and vulgar to interfere with that. I don't think it's human for the doctor to take time out. He says, I'll catch you a little later. But go on and do the job that has to be done. That's what I mean by behavior superfluous to the task. I think it's less human to stop and take time out for that kind of thing. On being human, if we ever do a book on that, it would be quite different from what most people
I don't know, though.
suspect.
Sometimes if a doctor takes a moment out, that might convince the boy to become a doctor himself, or, you know what I mean?
Yes, it might.
I admit you can't do it as a regular thing, but, really, it has its influence.
Well, you have to use your own judgment.
If it's done properly, it can,
Most
it can be-
appropriate.
I know it's a difficult
Yeah,
problem.
it is.
Yeah, because those extra moments of...
Well, let me ask you, let's do it real hardcore. When a plumber comes into your house, and the first thing you say is, what do you get for the job, and what do you get per hour? He says, we're only $40 an hour now. And the plumber comes in with all his shit, and says, let me tell you about my human problem. Because I got 3 kids, I can't do a thing with it. Your time. Right? You say, look, after you finish the job, let's go for coffee and bullshit. But you don't want that guy to talk to you on that time, right? Okay. So you're very hard.
Yeah, but it's your money.
But time in this system.
Yeah.
I used to remember I used to go visit a friend of mine that was a lawyer, and he had a big fat sign above his desk. He says, you know, my job is getting paid for giving advice. You know what I mean? A lot of people go to see lawyers. I got a brother-in-law lives in Chicago, and he came there and like, what should I do? Because they think the lawyer's office is right next door. So they go right and say, hey, Jim, what do you do about this? See, and lawyers are bothered by that. I'm not saying they're right or wrong. I'm just trying to think a little bit about the problem. Doctors are bothered quite a bit. They go to a party and they got a little pain back here, can't move the jaw. And you know, you go to a party and he goes down medical and what's your orthopedics? Okay, you see this? In other words, it happens quite a bit. So this doctor was advising other doctors on how to handle that. Go at a party, this lady comes and got a little thing, and he says, come on in the kitchen, take me closer. he discourages that. And it's just always good technique, or he hands him his card. Now, I'm not saying don't do that at all, but there are people that do that, and in the commercial world, it's not always a good idea. I'm talking about strangers on the outside, not somebody close to you. Okay. Anything else you want to discuss along those lines? All right. Anybody else? All right. Because if you diminish your contact with this type system, if you lose what this means, then you're not going to get the human relationship squared away. Okay. All humans tend to go through similar patterns. And it is true that if there were life forms on other planets or other galaxies, in order to manipulate things, turn things around, handle things, they would generally, if they are humanoid in shape, but not intellectually bright, and if they have a larger brain and not humanoid, not like a human being, say something like, say that the intelligent life on the other planet looked something like this. It had a kind of cup back here and a very large brain. They couldn't pick up things and make things and fit things together. Having been born with a larger brain and manual dexterity and the eyes at a certain position gives us better stereoscopic vision than having eyes on the side of our head. So a certain physical configuration, a certain size brain tends to produce certain patterns. In other words, if you notice that you can sit on a form like this fairly well, and difficulty sitting on a form like that people in other systems, other galaxies, if they're anything like us, tend to do and develop similar things. They tend to develop some kind of numerical system, some kind of mathematics. They tend to develop some kind of wheel. Everybody, a wheel. A wheel is inevitable. They tend to develop similar philosophies. If Loeb didn't exist, or Watson, or Freud, there would have been Freudians, because conditions make Freud, not Freud. Let's try that again. Conditions make Leonardo da Vinci, not Leonardo da Vinci. That means that the condition that you put a dog in, a police training center, makes a dog a guard, an attack dog. A dog brought up at a convent, where everybody pets it, doesn't bite anybody if everybody feeds it. So that dog is not a dog that sets its own values. So man seems to be some sort of a biological organism, fairly well equipped, dropped into an environment which proceeds to shape the values. Everybody has difficulty with that? If you take this person who's already been shaped, their values have been shaped, they're Seventh-day Adventist, and you drop them in another community of a different value setup, stress will occur. Now, conversation might occur. The other people are strange, they're different. I don't like them, or I don't identify with them. Stress occurs because some of the basic habit patterns have been established, and so you find stress. You find stress whenever your thoughts do not seem to be in accordance with events as they are. When you read a play to somebody, you assume they might like it or find it interesting. If they find it boring and unacceptable, you don't write it off as a different value system. I don't think. You feel a little depressed again. Is that right? Or you might turn and say, well, we will fill me in, elaborate. And say, hey, that's a good point. Have you ever done that? Where somebody comes up and they say, it's a very good way to talk to people. If you write something and I listen to it and say, I didn't like it at all, it's much better to say things like, during the early part, the introductory scene, how would you feel about this type modification? Rather than say, I didn't like it at all, you almost attack the person. It's much better, much easier to say, well, suppose we look at it from this point of view. You see, well, how do you feel about this suggestion? Invite the other person in. And getting along with another person is essentially inviting the other person in. And getting along with what they call an egocentric person, a person that's very self-centered. Getting along with a very self-centered person comes along, works out better when you say, I have given this matter some thought. I would like your point of view. And when you do that, I'm just saying getting along. I was saying it necessarily going to work. People feel less antagonism toward you. But when you better other people, constantly walk over and say, that's no way to handle direction of that play. And that you got the characters are poorly handled. If you hit too much, the person gets angry with you. If you say the little guy, if he came in a little slower, see, well, so then the person will listen to you. Well, what do you think of this suggestion? Then it looks like he is evaluating a suggestion. But if you say, let me tell you how you can improve your first scene, the guy feels that he's competent. And he didn't ask you how he might improve his first scene. So another way to do it, if you think about language, how do you feel about this suggestion? Now, how many of you ever use that? Ask me another question. How do you feel about this suggestion? All right. You come at it this way and says, I'd never do it the way you do. Jesus Christ. Person's your enemy right away. You're setting up what Freud calls, in earlier psychology, defense mechanisms in the other person. If a person comes at you like that, you will allow for it because they don't have the tools. They don't know how to deal with that kind of problem. Well, let's talk about rejection. What different types of rejection exist? Well, we always think of rejection as some personality rejecting ourselves. And there's linguistic rejection, attentiveness. We come to a party and I talk to everybody but you. Okay? And then there's every time you tell a joke, I make a certain face. Okay? There's rejection in terms of, can I get you something to drink? See, I turn to somebody else, not you. And you feel that you're a very important person at the party. Or I stand at the door with a longer handshake with Joe than with you. Everybody reacts to that. And so when I tell a joke, you don't like it too much at the party. Even if I pull out an interesting book that I read that you might have been interested in, had I not remained at the door shaking Joe's hand for a longer period of time than your hand. You understand what I mean? So all of these things set. You can think of human beings as having a sort of a kind of a temperature gauge in their body that moves up and down. Their mood, receptiveness, friendliness is a changing thing. Everybody, most people, like to be included. And it's extremely difficult to seemingly spend time talking to Don and interested in Don, and then Joe shows up. When I sit down and talk to Joe, Don might feel that he's left out. And then you show up, you haven't been here for 2 months, and I walk over and ask you what is new and all that sort of thing. Joe feels, well, shit, and he wants to converse with that. None of us have ever learned that the direction of conversation may have to do with a lot of factors which do not include rejection or acceptance. A lot of us think that if we have attentiveness of another person, that that other person is particularly fond of us. Sometimes they may not be, maybe for many other reasons. So, rejection. If I put a glass of cold drink down in front of somebody, they say, Jesus Christ, I've been thirsty all evening. I couldn't know that. But the point is that all these things set up problems. How do you put an end to these problems? The ideal way is to have a bar. Having everything from milk to Coca-Cola with an automatic dispenser. And if ye thirst, come ye here. So no one brings you anything. That's ideal. You understand? Unless you need help. Where you can walk out and take your jumpers, get your car started without dependence on other people. If you can attain that state where people do their own thing if they're physically able, you have a tendency then not to have problems. So the word, as I try to put out the last time, objective, has little meaning. When you work in an old folks' home, I don't care who you are, including me, when somebody comes over and says, they didn't know anything about my back, it's still painful, see? And these people really have a lot of pain. They really do. And Don said, Jesus Christ, you know, good bastards of pain. Yes. So what he talks about is his broken back, see, in a terrible condition. And so what we do is develop attitude, and we stop listening, even though the complaint is valid. This person has 7 points of miserable pain. They may be real. So we give it less attentiveness. It's like the man who cried wolf. You know why I stared at that reason for a moment? Subliminal language.
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah, would you? Please. Okay, I had a little horse throat, I looked in, there was no water. Now, if you check out your own telepathic stuff, you'll find out that you're able to do a hell of a lot. That's why you buy pencil letter early, or you buy transfer lettering, because you automatically know what your needs are going to be. Okay? Now, it is also true that the function of the physical body, that is your gut, or the gut level, has to do with your outlook. Thank you. If you feel depressed, or if you feel anxiety, here's what that means. Here's what anxiety means from this point of view. I won't use it in the other sense, conventional sense. Anxiety. Let's say Roxanne has something she wants to do here. For whatever reason, she can't get to do it, and it's important to her to do. Adrenaline flows, and she is physically restless because there's something she has to get done. Being physically restless is a time when a person doesn't want to engage in light conversation. Things will annoy them. Almost anything will annoy anybody that has something they want to do, they can't get to it. Adrenaline flows, you're uptight, edgy, ill at ease. That's what I mean by anxiety. People express their anxiety different ways. Sometimes chewing gum rapidly, rocking on a chair, fidgeting, moving around different ways. And the way they say it. And having anxiety is not a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. It just means that there's something you have to do, or something you think you have to do. And when you're dealing with that, people can't listen to you when they have something they have to do. If you can't pay the rent, you're about to be evicted from your house, you're not about to listen to anybody talking about, hey, I just bought a new car. That conversation annoys you more than anything. Especially people thinking how well off they are. They've just taken a 3-month trip, and he lost a job, can't pay the rent, they've taken the car away. And they're telling you about their ease, how easy things are. That annoys people. Any position that any human has over another annoys the other person. The existence of an Indian chief annoys the other one. Any leadership or one-upmanship or position of authority always annoys someone else, unless that authority is appropriate to the task. Here's what it means. There's another person in a plane, and the pilot just dropped dead, and I turn to the other person, can you handle it? He said, yes, I accept that authority. We always accept authority of functional immediacy and familiarity. How do I get out of this burning building? He says, take your blanket, soak it in water, drape it over yourself, and run through the hall. That is a good point. Never would have thought of that. See? In other words, we do appreciate functional authority if it's immediate and relevant. Don't go that way. That's the way of the gasoline storage system while we go out that way. We listen to that. Now, there are some people that don't, because they don't recognize functional authority. Functional means real. Somebody says, that fan is about to fall over, watch out, and then you push it back. That's real. If a person says, that type of blouse is bad out here in Florida, that attracts the bumblebee that stings. That would be, if it did, that's functional. Okay, so I'll wear it whether you like it or not. That would be an inappropriate answer. An appropriate answer is, where can I get more information on my shirt pattern and the behavior of bumblebees? Knowing the difference between attack, ego, inquiry is extremely difficult. Most of us do not know the difference. Does anybody know why we have so much difficulty recognizing the difference between, competitiveness, sheer knowledge, and things like that? Why do we miss? Yes.
Could it be that we're in a position where we can't be, because the people who have, let's say everybody has ego, let's say everybody has a similar problem, but there are engineers, for instance, that I work with, one in particular, who I think could use that ego. He could have other problems, but he's so necessary for the task that he could introduce it into the conversation, and he could get you to the point where you feel, maybe I don't know anything now, or maybe this guy's just introducing ego and you wrestle.
Yes.
You can't wrestle on their battleground unless you come up to their level technologically.
Right.
So they have you.
It's an everything thing.
And you've got to take on that person's problem.
Right. It's your conversation with the cameraman. You will go and tell the cameraman what you think before you've learned anything about midline shot, and after 4 o'clock shadows. Before you've learned anything about that, it's difficult for you to have conversation with the cameraman, except I certainly like the work in this film. But to have conversation with anyone, he says you have to come up to their level, meaning it's what we don't do in many instances. We don't try to find out what level a person's at in terms of values and knowledge and come at them. We say, well, I'm not ready to converse along these lines. I really don't have enough information. All right, you talk about being hurt. Well, being hurt is being excluded because of your own way of thinking. May not be excluded from a situation. Like if I say, well, I want you, and you to come with me, and you're left here in the back an elephant shed, they all have to remove it. See? So when you include certain people in a task and exclude others, it might be due to appropriateness of the situation. But more appropriate is how do you feel about elephant shed? No different than any other kind of shed. Doesn't make you sick or anything else. That says you're included. But we rarely do that. We make assumptions that he being the mayor of Chicago is not about to help remove the elephant shed. So the best thing to do without making anyone feel bad is to walk into the room saying elephant shed and pathway, anybody want to come out and help me remove it? And the mayor gets up and says, I don't mind at all. People respect the mayor, more so if he does that. If the mayor gets up and says, we're having tough times economically in Miami, we're going to have to lay off a lot of teachers and all that sort of thing, and says, I'm going to tighten my belt. I'm going to cut my salary in half to help keep the schools open instead of telling you to tighten your belts. See, they're always telling you to tighten your belt. And it's so much easier for the president to say, I'm moving out of the big house and giving them money for research and charity or some kind of thing. There's a president that people will do immediately tighten their belts without the president suggesting that they do. It's an interesting concept if you think about it. It's so easy to get things done that way. That's probably why Fidel Castro and others have gone out in the field and cut the sugar cane all day, sweating in the sun, with people. Look at El Presidente. Sure. You know, El Presidente shoveling the shit out of the old shit house. That's pretty good. It makes the people feel that you don't live like a king, you live like us. So it's an interesting thing if you're dealing with what they call the simple folks. The simple folks of the world can build a strong bond by identification. They can look up to you, respect you, but there's no bond because there's no identification. You can go in and tell these simple people who've traveled all over the world, you met with kings, and you've traveled on the finest boats of the world, and they say, "Eh, senor, you're in a lot of places," but there's no identification. It has to be. You have to go in and milk the cow. You have to shovel the shit out of the barn. And Pedro says, "I do that myself." He said, "I don't mind as long as you do it." And then Pedro, you now become a blood brother of Pedro. That's a real identification. So to be a good politician, it's a good idea to establish identification on whatever level you're at. And that goes for any kind of conversation. Number one, identification. After identification, introduction of ideas and modification. That's the order. You know what I mean by that? To simplify it again, asking people for their reaction to things, not their opinion. Tell them something and say, "What's your reaction?" All that together enables conversation to progress real well. Now let's talk about limiting factors, things that you encounter that make it difficult for you, things with people that you don't quite understand or overcome. Anybody want to bring up any areas that produce stress? Yes.
In broad terms, I look at society as we're all hanging on, in Veblen's terms.
Yeah.
And we're hanging on, and it's shaky out there, and all of us would have to go out there and work hard to hold on to whatever position we can hold on to. And those of us that want to speak out on certain social issues, it's even harder. You have to do that, plus hold on.
Yeah.
So
You jeopardize yourself
you always do.
continuously if you speak out.
And even if you don't speak out, you jeopardize because you have to keep up. The knowledge is increasing so much on the outside.
Yeah.
It's very rough to keep going in any direction right now.
Do you ever see the old films on women's suffrage? They get out in the street and speak for equal rights. I'm talking about in England in the very early days in America. Well, those women just had no ears. People would pass them by and smirk and smile. They couldn't hear it at all. It was very hard to believe. And yet, another 15 years from now, it'd be so common that no one would even, they'd wonder why they even had to bring that up.
So they had to...
They would wonder why people didn't understand it right away. They could, because they assume that people have a mind, and that people can understand things, and can tell them about it. They have no mind. There's no such thing as a human mind, and there's no such thing as thought and reason. There is a brain with a certain type of associative memory, and a certain type of associative system. And if it's different from yours, you might get beaten up by uttering a series of sounds that go into their head and trigger, "I'll beat the shit out of that guy." That's the way it works. That's why people don't. No, you go in the house and I say you've been married once. They say no 8 times. They say, "Well, we have some people coming over. We'll see you some other time." They have a reaction to what you say. I worked for the North Miami Zoo many years ago for a period of about, I think, 3 months, until the owner of the zoo said, "I want you to come home and meet the family," or something. I had dinner with him several times. And he had the Negro boy come around the back way on Christmas for a sandwich. And it's funny, the dog came in front. I said, and he said, "We're Baptists." I said, "I'm sorry to do that." And he gave me my paycheck. That was it. But in other words, he thought I was bright, but not that bright. In that, I killed myself. I lost a lot of jobs by speaking out. Now, a lot of people who were my friends used to put their arm around me and say, "Look, don't speak out. You can hold your job." And the whole idea is, if you don't speak out, we might be living in caves today. Somewhere down the line, somebody makes a sound somewhere. Now, The first day at the aircraft company that I worked at, the chief engineer said, "What do you think of our Douglas Act?" I walked off with, but this is terrible. It was a terrible place. It was a hand tool, the system of putting things together and all that sort of thing. And then he said to me, he said, "Well, I want to drive you home after your first day." And he drove me home, and he said, "You know, I am 55, and he was 55, I was about 21. I'm 55 years old, and you don't speak that way to older people, you know, 'cause I'm interested in your enthusiasm and all that. You got to tone down." And then the chief draftsman walked over to me one day. He says, "You talk to a lot of people about, you know, technocracy and socialism. Leave me on the drafting table." I said, "My work is done, isn't it?" He says, "Yeah. I've finished everything I'm supposed to finish for the day, and this is what I believe." He says, "I know, and all that's wonderful, but, you know, you got to do your work," he says. And then at other times, I would talk about things, and I was told not to. So this chief draftsman invited me out to dinner one day, and he joined technocracy. And then just do whatever you can, wherever you can, which is great. He was doing the same thing. So what is the conversation that belongs in an industrial plant? You ever hear that? There's a time and place for everything? What a terrible statement that is. As though when you walk into a factory, they own your brain that moment there. You want to turn around and say, "Hey, how's the wife and kids?" That's not related to the factory. And you say, "Jesus Christ, the air conditioning broke down in the engineering section. I'm dripping sweat all over my drawing." Or, "I can't work in this kind of heat." Well, that isn't related to the factory. You should work. Well, the idea is, what is related to the factory? And so when people own your brain, they say, "Well, I don't want you to do that on the job, on my time." We tell people what to do. And I think that you got to remember that if you're going to stick your neck out for social change, you really can get it flipped. And you can lose your job, you could be ejected from society, you can find yourself under great emotional stress if you take it personally. But as a charitable pattern of behavior, devote 3 to 5 minutes or 20 minutes of your time trying to enlighten other people. I think it's a good idea. But if you do it personally, you can get hurt. If you say, "I read an interesting thing in a book last week that Albert Einstein said." He said, "If every man works for himself, you divide up people. But if they work together, you build a better world." And so I also think Christ said that. And then you say, "What do you think?" Now, don't you come out with it. You can say, "Wise men have said this or that." That's a hell of a good thing. The Chinese were very good at that. They never sat down and said, "Let me tell you what I think." Say, "It has been written, inscribed on the purest of jade, that the dogs may howl at the moon, but the moon will continue upon its honorable journey." In other words, they have 1,000,001 bits of calendar philosophies, but they don't deliver it as though this is their thoughts. You see? And so they're protected that way. There are many businessmen who buy books, great quotations. You know, they read the book and they memorize it and they study it. And anything that happens, they have a, number 5. And religious people do that all the time. James 54. They go through anything you talk about. You check this paragraph in the Bible. See, they come at it. So it's a good idea to come at people from another source, changing behavior. Any other questions from Dr. Lewis? Yes.
How did you get so smart, know all this, and have gone through that kind of life? Where did you get all this information? Did you get
As a kid, living amongst kids whose parents were unemployed, we went to meetings, socialist meetings. There were free thinkers in those days. Every 3 blocks, there was a place like Young Socialist Club. Every 3 blocks in America. The Wobblies were dominant. They were there. There were guys in soapbox in every park. Hundreds of soapboxes. Jesus now.
When was that?
Follow with
Was
Jesus.
it the 30s?
Now.
When was that?
45, 50. 1950, 1945. In Los Angeles, you can go to the parks there. Hundreds of people gathered in different circles. This was religious harrying. Mohammedan Mali, natural food Sam, anti-natural foods. There were people sitting around and discussing Eastern philosophy and everything else. And right, there was a black line here. On this side were all the socialists, liberals, technocrats. On this side, they used to call them the sky pilots. They were metaphysicians, religionists, the cloud nine people. Always talking about the deity and meditation and free will. And on this side of the line is the hardcore, realist. There's a movie out you might be interested in. What was the name of that military movie? The Boys in Company C. Did anybody see it? It's the only movie I've ever seen that was anti-war. It's not a great movie, but it's got some interesting bits. Try to see it. It's training in the Marine Corps, how they treat people. Quite interesting. Shockingly interesting. And when you walk out of there, I think you get a lump in your throat when you're thinking of Nazis. How pleasant these times were. Don't see that movie. The Boys of Company C. Shall we go for coffee?